If we set out to hike hundreds of miles on the Appalachian Trail, it's easy to get the idea everything will go smoothly. Sometimes, however, there can be problems. Many of my past videos have talked about ways to avoid, solve, or minimize those problems. When I've had a problem on the AT, my only option was to deal with it by myself. And it could be that I've met or walked past hundreds of other hikers who are quietly dealing with some problem of their own. This video, however, is about something different. This is about the times when we, for whatever reason, are compelled to pay attention when another hiker has a problem. This does not include the situations when a hiker is in serious trouble, when they have a serious injury or illness. When that happens, our course of action is clear. We do something to help them. This could mean calling for help or hiking to get help. There have been many instances of AT hikers doing just that. Instead, I'm talking about a far less critical situation. Another hiker has an obvious problem, too obvious for us to overlook, and they might or might not ask for help. On my hikes, this has only happened a few times. But when it does happen, do we do anything? And if so, what exactly should we do? This is worth talking about because if we do enough hiking, many of us will encounter these situations. And as I always say, thinking about even small problems in advance has prevented or at least minimized problems for me later on. Even if somebody doesn't ask for my help in those situations, I always find myself thinking about how I could have helped if they did ask. We're going to look at several of these experiences I've had. My reaction has varied from wanting nothing to do with it all the way to taking charge of the situation. When it comes to using judgment, I'll never claim to make correct decisions 100% of the time. But I do believe my judgment has been improved by experience and thinking about issues in advance. If that wasn't the case, I wouldn't be making this video. When another hiker does have a problem, sometimes they will walk up and tell you all about it. In my own case, at least one experience like that proved educational for me. By way of background, since I was a rosy-cheeked young guy who looked like he belonged in high school, my entire career has been as a newspaper reporter and editor, and that's what I still do. I mention this because after a few years in the business, I felt like I was pretty reliable at reacting quickly and correctly to just about any situation that might occur. Sadly, that skill hasn't always followed me on the AT. What one hiker told me was so unexpected, I was practically flabbergasted and left sputtering before I could think of something intelligent to say. First, I'll tell you what happened. Then, I'll tell you what I should have done, which I did not realize until later. I had stopped and pitched my tent at an AT shelter in October. There were a couple of hours of daylight left when along came a day hiker. She was carrying a map and compass. She asked if I had seen a road that was marked on the map. As I know from personal experience, what seems obvious on a map is not always so obvious when we're actually looking for it in the woods. So, I pointed out the overgrown road, which also was a path to a spring. The hiker said her friends were going to come up the road and take her to her car. Many of those side trails from shelters lead to backcountry roads. She thought her friends would have been there by now, waiting for her. I wondered if her friends were walking or driving a four-wheeler, but first I asked if she could call them to see if they were still on schedule. She said she had left her phone in her car. If this encounter had taken place at 11 in the morning, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. Instead, it was going to get dark fast, and I knew her car was in a lot 5 miles away. On top of that, I knew temperatures would fall into the 30s before morning, which they did. She wasn't wearing a jacket, she had a water bottle, and not much else that I could see. I'm sure my voice got a little louder when I said, "What? Why aren't you carrying your phone?" She said she didn't carry it because she wanted to relax and not be bothered by civilization. Nothing about this situation made me think friendly sympathy was going to be enough if those friends of hers didn't show up and she was stuck there. I replied, less than calmly, no doubt, that I didn't want to be bothered by civilization either, and all I had to do was turn my phone off. I quickly did some math in my head. I knew how much daylight was left. If she headed for her car immediately, it could move fairly quickly, she'd make it to the car before it got really dark. She said she hoped her friends showed up soon and wandered out of sight. I decided if she came back, I would ask her to call her pals on my phone. I had a good signal there. The weakness of this idea is the friends wouldn't recognize my phone number. Odds were high she'd have to leave a voicemail, and who knows when they would listen to the voicemail. Meanwhile, I wasn't going to invite her into my tiny tent, and I would have sounded like a creep had I suggested it. If she did get stuck there overnight, I figured I'd loan her my Frog Togs jacket and tell her if the shelter was too cold, she'd be out of the wind in the privy, which I'd already checked out. Very quickly, some other women stopped and started setting up tents. The day hiker walked over and started talking to them. I knew that whatever happened, she wasn't going to talk to my rude ass again. And I don't know exactly what did happen, except she lived through it. The news would have been on Google if she had not. So, what should I have done? If I had been thinking like an editor, I might have solved her problem with one sentence. I would have said, "Do you know their phone number? If you do, I can send them a text message." And if she didn't know the number, at least the conversation would have gotten off to a better start. On that same trip, I encountered another day hiker who wasn't having a good day. He was in the middle of a 20-mile walk from one parking area to another. He was wearing an old pair of shoes, and one half of one shoe was missing. The entire top was missing, leaving only the toe and heel. The good shoe was held on by a Velcro strap. I assumed the other shoe broke, and he removed the torn part. Sometime earlier, I met two friends of his moving in the same direction. They told me he had fallen behind because of that shoe. I asked him how it was going. If necessary, I figured we could tie on a bandana to keep his foot from falling out of the shoe. I had an extra bandana with me. He said, with a laugh, that things were going slow, but he was moving. I wasn't worried about him because plenty of daylight was left. He appeared to be between 18 and 20 years old. When I was his age, my friends and I often got ourselves into messes not much different from his. Almost a routine experience in my crowd. And his friends, who certainly knew him better than I, weren't worried about him at all. And I bet he made sure such a shoe problem never happened again. One of my section hikes ended where I parked my car in a lot where the AT crossed the road. I was loafing at a picnic table and three thru hikers came out of the woods. One of them was carrying a pack with only one good strap. The other strap had broken. They said they would hitchhike to Lexington, Virginia, about 40 miles away, to buy a new pack there. I told them their problem was solved because I would drive them there. One of them gave me gas money before we said goodbye in Lexington. Yet another story I've told before. I was at an AT shelter with a seasonal spring, meaning the spring was often dry. On that night, it was empty. A father and two sons soon arrived, finishing up an 18-mile day. They were out of water. We set out looking for a spring, which we didn't find. I later figured out we'd overlooked the spring because it was in a metal shed. We'd assumed the shed belonged to a utility like a gas company. The dad was worried because one of his sons was a diabetic and needed water. We walked to the nearby Blue Ridge Parkway for a better cell phone signal. The dad called the sheriff's office and was told nobody would bring water to him. The dad wanted to hitchhike to a motel, and the sons rejected the idea. I doubt that would have worked anyway, because the parkway is essentially a limited access road that doesn't get much traffic. I had only 1 liter of water on me and would hand it over if need be. But first, back at the shelter, I went to the spring, pulled out all the rocks and leaves, and started digging with my trowel. One of the sons asked what I was doing. If I dug deep enough, I told him, water would collect in the spring. Soon after it did. We strained the water with bandanas and treated it, while the dad solemnly told his sons, "This is a survival situation." I don't know if things were that dire, but we did all live through it. Since we were going in opposite directions, I discovered the next day that they had walked past several water sources on their hike to that shelter. They didn't know it at the time, but walking past those sources was a mistake. At yet another shelter, I encountered a man and woman. It was getting cold, and they decided to build a fire. The woman pulled some pages from a trail guide out of her pack. It looked like she had made them with a copy machine to avoid copying the entire book. She was going to light those pages to start the fire. "Please don't," I said. "You might need those later, and I have something better." I always carry a few pieces of cotton smeared with Vaseline. homemade fire starters. This is a trick well known among Boy Scouts and bushcrafters. The pair looked quite confused until I promised that if they lit one under the little pile of sticks, they would have a decent fire in less than a minute. They had to admit the trick worked like a charm, and the trail guide was spared. The one incident that worried me the most was one that I thought I could do absolutely nothing about. So, rightly or wrongly, I didn't even want to know what had happened. I had stopped at a section of trail that passed over the tops of enormous rocks with very sharp drops that went down to very steep hillsides. At spots, the trail was on the edge of genuine cliffs. I had been there about 15 minutes when I heard a woman who had come up behind me. She was doing a lot of yelling and calling her dog. Dogs are supposed to be leashed on the Appalachian Trail. The AT Conservancy says so. The link's in the description. Yet, many dogs are not on leashes on the trail. As I sat and listened, the woman's voice got louder, then quieter, then louder, then quieter. She was moving back and forth along the trail, calling the dog. This went on for several minutes, and the more I heard, the more it worried me. I was worried because I once owned a dog, and here he is. His name was Buster. He had a great heart, and I loved him, but it's also true he had what we might call limited cognitive ability. When he was a puppy, he bounded right off the edge of a deck, through the metal rails, and landed with a bounce on the ground about 6 feet below. He was only bruised, the veterinarian told me soon afterward, but I was shocked it happened too fast for me to react, and he was too excited to look where he was going. Because of my experience with Buster, my worst fear was the woman's dog. He made a long fall off of one of those rocks and rolled to the bottom of one of those steep hills. I put on my pack and headed out. I decided the woman's dog had just ran off after a squirrel and would return in a few minutes. At least that's what I hope happened. That had to be what happened, right? Whatever happened, it could have been avoided if the dog was on a leash. And now we are once again done. Please check out my Facebook page. I still post news about the outdoors regularly there. The link is in the description. And thanks for watching.